It has been 8 years since I last stood to speak as a backbencher, and it is a privilege to do so again. When I left these benches, it was to become a minister in the Treasury, and it seems apt that I went back to whence I came, the circle of life. I'm very proud to represent the good people of Bromsgrove, and I will, of course, continue to do so. I will also continue to champion the causes that I believe in most, albeit from outside the government. I confess that I had hoped to have a little longer to make a difference from the inside. So, with thanks for your permission to speak, Mr. Speaker, I thought it would be appropriate to briefly explain first to the House why I felt that I had to resign as Chancellor of the Exchequer. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank all those colleagues in this chamber and beyond for their messages of thanks in the last 2 weeks. And I want to take the opportunity too to thank my family for their love and patience over the last few years. Yeah. I came into politics, Mr. Speaker, to give something back to the country that has given me so much. And while I do not intend this to be my last chapter in public life, in whichever form that may take, I'm immensely grateful for the trust and the support of colleagues in all the roles that I have had. After first holding 2 ministerial positions within the Treasury and then returning as Chancellor, I've had the huge privilege of running 4 departments. Each taught me more than the last, and it shaped my understanding of government. I can look back and say to myself, very sincerely, that I have never once made a decision, or indeed given advice on a decision, that I did not believe was in the national interest. You see, Britain's democracy and economy are strong because of its institutions and its people. Conservatives especially believe that no particular person, or even a government, has a monopoly on the best ideas. It is through these checks and balances of credible institutions, be it the Treasury, the Bank of England, the Office of Budget Responsibility, indeed this House, that we arrive at sensible decisions that are in the national interest. Now, when reflecting on the dynamic between number 10 and number 11, it is natural to look at past relationships. There is no one size that fits. Any model that works or doesn't depends on the personalities that are involved just as much as the processes. It depends on the mutual respect and trust that allows for constructive, creative tension between teams. And it is that creative, that dynamic, that it has always been the case that advisers advise, ministers decide, and ministers decide on their advisers. I couldn't see why the Treasury, with the vital role that it plays, should be the exception to that. A Chancellor, like all Cabinet Ministers, has to be able to give candid advice to a Prime Minister, so he is speaking truth to power. I believe that the arrangement proposed would significantly inhibit that, and it would not have been in the national interest. So while I was grateful for the continued trust of the Prime Minister in wanting to reappoint me, I'm afraid that these were conditions that I could not accept in good conscience. Now, I don't intend to dwell further on all the details and the personalities. The comings and goings, if you will. Much of... Now, Mr. Speaker, much of this commentary was just gossip and distraction, and now it is in the past. I very much hope that the new Chancellor will be given the space to do his job without fear or favour. And I know this, Mr. Speaker, that my right honourable friend for Richmond is more than capable of rising to the challenge. He worked for me as a local government minister and as Chief Secretary, and I could not have asked for a better working relationship. Indeed, I had lobbied the PM for him to be given the role of Chief Secretary and to keep it at the recent reshuffle, but I didn't get my way on that one. So, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has won a huge mandate to transform our country. And already he is off to a great start, ending the parliamentary paralysis, defeating the radical left, getting Brexit done, a points-based immigration system and an infrastructure revolution. Now our party, our government, has a huge opportunity and a responsibility ahead. We need a resolute focus on long-term outcomes and delivery, not short-term headlines. The Treasury as an institution, as an economic ministry, should be the engine that drives this new agenda. And since last summer, it has done just that, from planning properly for Brexit to bringing in a generational step change in infrastructure investment, from rewriting the Green Book to better favour our regions, to long-term thinking on human capital and designing the blueprint for levelling up across our country. I'm incredibly proud of the scale and the speed of the work that has already been done. But the Treasury must also be allowed to play its role as a finance ministry with the strength and credibility that it requires. You see, I'm a proud, low-tax Conservative, and I always will be. Already, our tax burden is the highest it's been in 50 years. It is fair to say that not everyone at the centre of government always feels the pressure to balance the books. It was ever thus. But the Treasury has a job to do. It is the only tax-cutting ministry. Every other department has an inbuilt incentive to seek and to spend ever more money. Not that I did that when I ran departments, of course. But trade-offs have to be made somewhere. I see my right honourable friend for Maidenhead is agreeing with that. And at a time when we need to do much more to level up across generations, it would not be right to pass the bill for our day-to-day consumption to our children and grandchildren. And unlike the US, we don't have the fiscal flexibility that comes with a reserve currency. So that's why the fiscal rules that we are elected on are critical. To govern is to choose. And these rules crystallise the choices that are required. To keep spending under control, to keep taxes low, to root out waste, and to pass that litmus test that was rightly set in stone in our manifesto of debt being lower at the end of the Parliament. Now, while I'm, of course, disappointed not to be finishing what I started, I look to the future not with apprehension, but with great optimism. Yeah. We on these benches, we have a shot at achieving nothing less than wholesale renewal for our economy, our society, and for our country. A chance to give everyone an opportunity to live up to their full potential, and wherever they live and whatever their background, a chance to put people, place, and social justice at the heart of a more human capitalism, and to bring our country together as one nation. Mr. Speaker, I know that this is a shared vision, and I firmly believe that my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has the tenacity, the energy, and the skill to see it through. I want to leave the House in no doubt that he has my full confidence and the government my full support to get it done.
Just sit, mate. Point of order, Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, would it be in order for me to thank my right honourable friend for the grace with which he has just spoken, for his immense service to this country in several departments, and to remind my right honourable friend that he has friends and admirers on all sides of this House of Commons.
Let's talk about this with David Gork. He's the former Justice Secretary, former Tory MP, of course, one of those leading Remainers who ended up losing the whip and standing as independents and the like after the battles over Brexit. And he joins us now. Good morning to you, David.
Morning, Julia.
Lovely to speak to you. There was quite a lot of worries, as they usually are on front benches, when a former cabinet minister, particularly one as senior as Sajid Javid, as former chancellor, makes a personal statement. We've certainly seen former cabinet ministers making devastating statements. I mean, for instance, the like of Geoffrey Howe, rather famously with Margaret Thatcher, obviously a very big issue. Lots of the papers are saying he sort of lobbed a political hand grenade at Downing Street yesterday when he criticised the growing influence of Dominic Cummings, and also talked about actually the danger of higher taxes and basically spending too much. How damaging do you think his resignation speech was?
Well, I thought it was quite a carefully judged resignation speech. It certainly wasn't anything like as devastating as Geoffrey Howe or even Norman Lamont. I think those are the last two chancellors who resigned or who were sacked who did resignation speeches. So I don't think he was trying to topple the Prime Minister or fundamentally undermine him, but there were some very carefully worded comments that were directed, I think, in the direction of Dominic Cummings. I think there were some concerns that Sajid has got as to the direction of the government, one in terms of the centralisation of power inside Number 10 and organisations like the Treasury being weakened, but also a direction of significantly higher spending, and that higher spending is either going to result in more borrowing or more taxation, or indeed perhaps a combination of the two.
Yeah.
And I think Sajid is someone who's more of a sort of low-tax, fiscally conservative figure, more conventional conservative, if you like, just wanted to lay a marker that there are consequences of turning on the spending tap.
And this was what's thought to be behind this dispute between the two men, such as it existed, which was that this high spending all this money, all this infrastructure spending and current expenditure to try and sort of boost some of the spending and the investment in the northern countries. This red wall, which came over to the Tory party in December election. But something has to give, and either you cut spending elsewhere, or you do borrow more, or you tax more. These are exactly the sort of things that we were told that Tories didn't do.
Exactly. No, I think you put it very well. The thing is, with all policy decisions, is they are trade-offs. And if you increase spending, then either you borrow more or you tax more, and you have to face up to that. And it's not in the DNA of the Conservative Party to want to either borrow more or to tax more. And there are some sort of fundamental choices that have to be made. And I think what Sajid Javid was doing was saying, look, if this is the way that we go, and if you weaken the Treasury so that there's always a pressure coming from Number 10 to do more of this and do more of that. I was a Treasury Minister for 7 years, mostly at a time when the relationship between Number 10 and Number 11 was extremely strong. But there are fundamental different incentives, if you like. If you're the Prime Minister, your main task is to maintain your popularity. You want to be re-elected. If you're Chancellor of the Exchequer, you want to establish a reputation of being a solid Chancellor who has left the public finances in a strong position.
Yes, they're very different rules. Well, I wanted to talk to you actually about this. Your 7 years in the Treasury, and of course your final year, 2016-2017, you were Chief Secretary of the Treasury, the job that Rishi Sunak was in before he took over. The budget date was already set in March, in a week and a half's time, before he took over, and he's carrying on sticking with that date. How involved is the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, and indeed other Treasury ministers, in the run-up to the budget in terms of actually setting spending and looking at the figures and being closely involved in the budget?
It very much depends on the individual circumstances, to be honest. I was fortunate that I was, if you like, the tax minister under George Osborne and the chief secretary under Philip Hammond. And in both cases, I had very good relationships with the Chancellor, and I was heavily involved in the process. There have certainly been other occasions, and you go back to the days when Gordon Brown, for example.
Oh, yes.
And very often the Chief Secretary to the Treasury would be a Blairite, would be placed there by Tony Blair to keep an eye on Gordon Brown. And I think the Chief Secretary was kind of kept out of the process as much as possible. So it depends. The sense I have is that Rishi was pretty heavily involved in the budget, that actually there was a good relationship between Sajid and Rishi. So I suspect that there will be no huge surprises to Rishi Sunak in terms of what is happening and the policy options
Yes.
so on. But it's a hugely challenging task to take over a budget, 4 weeks or so before it's due to be delivered. Given that all the decisions have to be made, at least a week in advance, because they've got to go to the Office of Budget Responsibility and so on. So it's a really tight timetable, and I think I don't know what's going to be in the budget, but I think it would be understandable if the new chancellor starts off with a relatively slim budget.
Well, this is it.
Expectations for later in the year.
We were speaking to Paul Johnson, director of the Institute of Fiscal Studies, earlier, and not only just because taking it over rather late, but also the fears over the coronavirus and the downturn in the world economy that may result from the impact on Chinese manufacturing and a downturn in international travel and the like. That this could have a knock-on effect, and perhaps it would be rather sensible, rather prudent, to not make major changes at this time when things are so up in the air.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and there's a lot to be said because of not only the coronavirus, although that is very substantial, but also the Brexit negotiations, how they are going to go. That will have an impact as well. So there's a huge amount of uncertainty just at the moment, and that would suggest, I think, a relatively cautious budget and giving the new chancellor time to work out what he wants to do. Some of these policy issues are themselves incredibly complex. There's been a lot of talk about pensions tax relief. When I was in the Treasury in 2016, we spent months and months and months looking at this, getting our head around it. It's incredibly
You got it rather wrong.
No, I don't.
Well, we saw one of the reasons we've had an NHS crisis was because the changes to pension tax relief that meant that it wasn't worth the while of NHS consultants to carry on working.
You raised a point. In 2016, we were looking at a more fundamental change, but it is worth bearing in mind that if it's more salami slicing of the current pension tax system, then you do run into issues with hospital consultants, GPs, judges, essentially the higher paid public sector workers who have generous pension arrangements, but that's kind of part of their remuneration. If you attack the pension tax, then suddenly their remuneration is a lot less generous. So that's an example of how these decisions need to be very carefully thought through, and it's very hard for a new chancellor to do that in just 2 or 3 weeks.
Let's also talk about, obviously, one of the biggest political issues, the reason why you're no longer in the cabinet, in government, or indeed as an MP, is, of course, the government's Brexit plans. Today, we're going to see published in the House of Commons what the government's Brexit trade talks stance is going to be. We saw already on Tuesday what the EU side have published. Number 10 gave a very short shrift and basically said a lot of the things they wanted, free access to continue to the UK's fishing waters, a sort of having not just a level playing field, but adherence to EU rules and the like, wasn't going to really pass muster anymore. What are you expecting to happen? You're someone who doesn't want Brexit to happen. You think it's a bad thing for the country. It is going. It has happened. We have left. The aim now is to get a good trade deal. What do you think the best trade deal is that we can get, and how likely is it?
I'm a pessimist that we are going to get a decent trade deal this year. I think generally we'll get something. It is very rushed. It's not really time to do a comprehensive deal, but we'll get something. But I'm increasingly concerned that the chances are we won't get anything this year.
So we trade on WTO terms on the 1st of January next year?
Yes, I think that's quite possible. I'm not saying it will happen, but
why do you think that is the case? Given that the argument from the Remainers has always been the free trade between the EU economies is the same thing. Why would the Germans, the French, the Italians, and others want to not have free trade with us?
Well, and why would we not want to have free trade with them?
We do.
We do, but the parties are a long way away. I think that there is. To some extent, the UK position is a very fundamental position. If you look at the sort of David Frost speech in Brussels last week, he was talking about the whole point of Brexit is to recover our political and economic independence in full. There isn't a lot of wriggle room there.
Because I was rather encouraged by that, I have to say.
I'm sure you were, in the same way as I was discouraged. But I think the UK government's taking a very purist view, and the European Union is taking a view that it wants to, if you like, protect the integrity of the single market. And if it's going to grant, if you like, preferential trade access to the UK, it wants to ensure that the UK doesn't engage in what they consider to be unfair competition on things like state aid, subsidies to businesses, or that the protections on social and environmental matters aren't sort of undercut and undermining the sort of cohesiveness of the single market. Now, that's the approach that they are taking. I think they're probably pretty dug in on that, and I think we're pretty dug in on recovering our economic and political independence in full. And I think the two parties are a long way away, and both, in truth, both sides need to compromise if we're going to reach a deal.